Many of the top 5 and top 10 videos I make, as well as quite a few of my reviews, involve games that I have a history with to some degree, and in many cases, those games are actually pretty personal to me. Obviously, the nostalgia of replaying many of the games I cover for this channel is a massive part of their appeal to me, and why I find myself replaying games that are like 20 plus years old versus a lot of newer releases that came out in the past like 4 or 5 years. And let me tell you, there are few games out there or franchises out there that are as like nostalgic and special to me as the Virtua Fighter series. What distinguished the first Virtua Fighter game, as well as many of its sequels, from most other fighting games was its much more realistic, grounded style of play. Each character's particular fighting style is rooted in real-life martial arts, and just like in real martial arts, reading your opponent, knowing when to strike, and, when to block and avoid attacks is a critical part of, Virtua Fighter's gameplay. Yeah, you won't be shooting fireballs like you're Goku, or I suppose actually are Goku, depending on what game you're playing.
Goku, you are very weak. I want to feed you now. You are very strong. So are you. Yes, and we are almost equal in power. I must do something drastic. Oh my god, what happened? Oh my god!
No, Virtua Fighter heavily revolved around timing, patience, reading your opponent, and delivering the right moves at the right time to defeat whoever you're up against. This essentially means that these games are hardcore when it comes to their depth and competitiveness, which, yeah, for the record, I'm not even pretend that I'm well-versed in or skilled enough to even hang with, like, probably the top 50% of Virtua Fighter players. However, despite my lack of competitive skill with these games, I can still appreciate how engaging, fun, and, yeah, pretty much just well-designed most of the games are in this series, and that's a huge part of why I've continued to play them for over 3 decades now. Of course, it'd be a crime against humanity if I didn't mention those involved in creating this iconic fighting game franchise. Possibly Sega's most famous, innovative, and certainly most iconic development studios, Sega AM2 was responsible for gifting this series to the world in the first place, and also being behind every new mainline installment in the series to this very day. And while you may have never actually heard of Sega AM2, you have almost undoubtedly heard of or played one of their iconic games. Yeah, whether it was Outrun, or maybe it was Afterburner, or maybe it was even Space Harrier, or possibly it was even the GOAT of all GOAT, Shenmue. Yeah, you probably played one of these games at one point. And speaking of Shenmue, if not for Virtua Fighter, Shenmue may have never happened in the first place. That's right, Yu Suzuki, the man who essentially made Sega AM2 the powerhouse it would become, originally envisioned Shenmue as Virtua Fighter RPG, but eventually became its own thing independent of the Virtua Fighter series. Well, sort of.
Hey, what's this?
But yeah, before I start gushing over the Shenmue series like a complete fanboy, which, I kind of am for the Shenmue series, I'm not even gonna hide it or anything like that. Nerd! Nerd! Yeah, let's get back to the Virtua Fighter series, shall we? It seriously blows my mind that I've been playing Virtua Fighter games now for over 30 years, and that, thankfully, Sega has stayed committed to keeping this franchise alive via a million updated versions of Virtua Fighter 5. But maybe most importantly was the recent announcement of a brand new Virtua Fighter game, which will probably, likely, I don't know, maybe come out in the next few years or so. Let's hope it does at least. But yeah, going back to those earlier, more simple times growing up, I remember seeing the original Virtua Fighter arcade cabinet at my local shopping mall arcade and being completely mind-broken by how awesome and futuristic the full 3D graphics looked. And no, I didn't suffer from childhood alcoholism or eat paint chips as a kid or anything like that.
I told you, there's alcohol in that. It's not for kids. You're not for kids.
To many of us younger, more impressionable gamers back in the early and mid-90s, yeah, this looked like the future, and it was beyond exciting for me at the time. Throughout the 1990s, Virtua Fighter would remain not just my go-to 3D fighting game, but kinda, sort of, like, my main fighting game, period. Yet, for me, it was right up there with games like Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter, or, Super Street Fighter 2 in terms of just how much I loved playing these games. Unfortunately, as the greatest decade in modern history came to a close, so did the prominence of the Virtua Fighter series in my life, until unfortunately, or I guess fortunately depending on how you look at it, franchises like Tekken and King of Fighters became the fighting game franchises I inevitably ended up gravitating towards. There were also franchises like Street Fighter, which I continued to play and which continued to remain relevant in my life, yeah, throughout the 2000s and 2010s. While my love and adoration for the first 2 Virtua Fighter games remained strong since I first played them, I wouldn't actually start to dive heavily into the series until years later with some of the updated versions of Virtua Fighter 5. However, like reuniting with an old old best friend, the Virtua Fighter franchise has now once again become one of my favorite fighting game franchises, and a series that I return to regularly to this day. Before we get into our top 5, I'm going to do something that I've actually never done in one of my countdown videos before. For this video, I'm going to give an honorable mention to the first Virtua Fighter game that, started this entire series, and if it wasn't for how impactful and awesome this game was, yeah, the rest of these games wouldn't be here right now for me to talk about. Yeah, that's right, the original Virtua Fighter just barely missed the cut when it came to this list. I'd have likely slipped into a deep dark depression or, at least lost a bunch of sleep had I not at least mentioned the first Virtua Fighter game, which, yeah, it's still incredibly fun to play, and it's also very iconic and has remained so for over 30 years now, since it came out in 1993. Beyond just launching a franchise, it also really helped popularize 3D fighting games back in the 1990s, for better or worse, depending on who you ask. And look, if we were talking about top 5 Virtua Fighter soundtracks, yeah, this game probably would have ranked number 1, or at the very least, number 2. I'm dead serious about that, like, no bullshit. Yeah, this soundtrack in this game is just completely amazing. It's so good. Beyond how much I still love this game, and yeah, absolutely adore its soundtrack, I mean, seriously, go listen to it. Yeah, I have to be honest about this game, at least to some degree, and I will admit that the gameplay is fairly clunky, and yeah, it's fairly basic too, especially compared to like a lot of the later games that came in the franchise. Oh yeah, and for some, those original jagged polygons that, the characters were designed with, yeah, they probably still make you shudder in disgust to this day. But with all that out of the way, yeah, let's jump into our countdown to the top 5 Virtua Fighter games of all time, according to me, of course. Number 5, Virtua Fighter 3 TB. In a way, I kind of feel bad about placing Virtua Fighter 3 TB at the bottom of this countdown, despite it beating out the various VF games that didn't make this list. For one, Virtua Fighter 3 TB is an excellent game with much needed refinements and improvements to its gameplay, including the sidestep mechanic, which makes matches way more dynamic and fun. And of course, there's also the inclusion of the team battle mechanic, hence the TB in the title. No, it isn't short for tuberculosis, because yeah, you were totally thinking that, right?
I think this is a piece of your lung. Ew.
Thank you.
But yeah, the team battle mechanic more or less allows you to change characters between rounds King of Fighters style if you want, which is a neat inclusion, but hardly anything to write home about. Overall though, the gameplay was great and an undeniable upgrade over Virtua Fighter 2's gameplay. Visually, the game looks pretty impressive, especially its stages, which ditch the square fighting rinks of the previous 2 games, and instead has you fighting on uneven rooftops, the ruins of the Great Wall of China, and in a cool subway station too, just to name a few. However, most of all visually, Kage's solid steel chastity clubbing pants steal the show above all else when it comes to the visuals of Virtua Fighter 3. Yeah, no need to lock your daughters up when Kage hits the town. Nope, you don't have to worry about him.
And this is his trophy winch, Maid Madeline.
Ding!
But yeah, kidding aside, the visuals definitely were a noticeable leap forward compared to Virtua Fighter 2's. Unfortunately, when it comes to improvements over Virtua Fighter 2, I really can't say the same about VF3's OST. I mean, it's still one of the best fighting game OSTs you're bound to hear, but yeah, Virtua Fighter 2's, it's just in a league all of its own. The reason why 3TB ranks at the lowest spot on this countdown has more to do with the game marking a bit of a stagnation point in the mainline series more than anything. By the time Virtua Fighter 3 hit arcades in 1996, it started to get some real competition in the form of the Tekken series, as well as other fighting games that would begin to whittle away at its dominance as the de facto 3D tournament fighter. A year later, when 3TB came out, we also got Tekken 3 at that point, and well, VF3 really didn't stand a chance. And look, I'm not some hardcore Tekken bro, but yeah, it's nearly impossible to deny how much better Tekken 3 is compared to Virtua Fighter 3 TB. Not to mention Tekken 3's legacy still, which lives on to this day. Meanwhile, when was the last time you heard anyone say anything good or, was raving about how great Virtua Fighter 3 TB was? Yeah, my point exactly.
I'm okay. Alright, you reported, mother's
Don't get me wrong though, I still thoroughly enjoy playing 3TB, and it's still a game I pop into my Dreamcast every few years to binge for hours. Even with its shortcomings and being overshadowed by almost every other mainline entry in the VF series, Virtua Fighter 3TB is still an excellent time and one I'd still highly recommend you go play. Number 4, Fighters Mega Mix. Funny enough, I actually didn't really care for Fighters Mega Mix the first time I played it years ago. I know, right? What the hell was up my butt when I played this game for the first time? Well, fortunately, I'm no longer allergic to fun, and I gave this game another chance while making this video, and yeah, I can say safely that I am no longer an angry little moron who once hated this awesome, fun, incredible Sega Saturn classic. That's right, Fighters Mega Mix, despite not having Virtua Fighter in the title, is the 4th best Virtua Fighter game you can possibly play. For one, nearly half the roster in this game is made up of Virtua Fighter characters, yeah, which also include a couple of the characters from the Virtua Fighter Kids game. On top of that, Seba, who is actually a cut character from the original Virtua Fighter, and who, for some reason, ended up on the arcade cabinet, which, yeah, you can bet Sega fired someone for that mess up. Yeah, he's in this game too as a playable character, which, yeah, it's pretty awesome. And you know, Virtua Fighter characters really aren't your jam. There are a ton of other characters from various other Sega fighting game series. Yeah, mainly Fighting Vipers, but also some obscure and also some not so obscure Sega characters from various other games and franchises too. Yeah, no bullshit. You can actually play as the car from Daytona, USA. And yeah, no, I am not joking about that either. And yeah, when was the last time you played a fighting game where you can play as a freaking car and beat the shit out of your opponent? Yeah, that's right. You got nothing.
Finish him! Fatality.
But anyways, the best part of all this is about a third of the characters are unlocked just by playing the game, just as God intended it to be. But outside the huge character roster for its time, there is an equally huge amount of stages to fight in and tons of excellent tracks, some original and many from the various Sega franchises represented in Fighters Mega Mix. As for the Virtua Fighter side of things, VF characters play as you're used to, albeit the game definitely takes on less of a patient, tactical style of play like in the core games, and more of the style on par with what you'd find in Fighting Vipers. Don't be dismayed just yet though. There are even aspects of Virtua Fighter 3's gameplay that made it into Fighters Mega Mix, despite this game coming out before that game. Pretty cool, huh? But even though this game might not be as deep or technical as most of the mainline Virtua Fighter games, it's still an absolute riot and, yeah, will keep you hooked between all the awesome unlockable characters and costumes, as well as its kinda broken, but still fun as hell gameplay. So yeah, turn your brain off for a few hours, Virtua Fighter fans, and play some Fighters Mega Mix, why don't ya?
Yeah! Tonight!
Number 3, Virtua Fighter 5 Ultimate Showdown. Before everyone comes rushing at me with pitchforks, torches, and downvotes, yeah, hear me out for a sec. VF5 Ultimate Showdown is an outstanding game. Like seriously, this game is so unbelievably fun and good to play, it's not even funny. Whether you're just playing this game casually online with a friend, or, you know, going balls to the wall and want to become the best of the best when it comes to this game, yeah, you're bound to have a good time either way. What I'm trying to say is that I don't hate Virtua Fighter 5 just because it lands at the number 3 spot.
Little SOB. If I ever find out who you are, I'm gonna shove a sausage down your throat and stick starving dogs in your butt.
I freaking love this game. It just had some very stiff competition that we'll get into soon enough. While various other Virtua Fighter games received multiple updates and enhanced versions, none of them, and I mean seriously none of them, have shit on Virtua Fighter 5. Virtua Fighter 5 was originally released in arcades all the way back in the simpler times of 2006, nearly 20 years ago, and has since received 6 revised versions of this game. In fact, its most recent update, Virtua Fighter 5 Revo, just came out like a week ago, and yeah, even though it's more or less just a PC port of Ultimate Showdown, Virtua Fighter 5 has been getting support and updates for so long that its earlier versions look nothing like the newest entries, and also in many ways play differently too. You could almost consider the games that came up before 5 Ultimate Showdown to be different entries in the franchise altogether, seeing how much 5 has evolved since its humble 2000s beginnings. But yeah, for the sake of time, we're not going to open up that can of worms. Despite how good some of those previous versions of 5 are, yeah, for the best time possible with Virtua Fighter 5, you definitely have to play Ultimate Shodown or Revo. Ultimate Shodown was released in 2021 to much surprise and hype for many longtime fans of the series. Essentially, Ultimate Shodown overhauled not just the graphics engine used in its predecessor, Virtua Fighter 5 Final Showdown, but also its gameplay too, which was already really tight in Final Showdown. In fact, its gameplay was so refined and balanced, Sega's name for this game and many other parts of the world is actually Virtua Fighter 5 Esports. Yeah, Sega wasn't f***ing around when they were trying to court the hardcore competitive fighting game scene with this game. And with esports in the title, yeah, you bet the gameplay is more polished than Cameron's dad's diaper-polished Ferrari.
Wow, Ferris? He never drives it. He just rubs it with a diaper.
Ultimate Shodown is almost one of the deepest, most well-balanced fighting games you can possibly play, which means that whatever I have at number 1 and number 2 on this list, yeah, it better be something. Yeah, well, let's find out.
Oh, I have a bad feeling about this.
Number 2, Virtua Fighter 2. Yeah, if you hated me for placing Virtua Fighter 5 Ultimate Showdown at number 3, yeah, you're really gonna hate me even more for, you know, placing a game released nearly 30 years prior ahead of it.
Kids, won't you step outside for a second?
Dear Lord, that's the loudest profanity I've ever heard.
And no, this isn't some edgy, contrarian pick to get people all riled up in the comments. I genuinely enjoy Virtua Fighter 2 a decent amount more than 5, yeah, even with the concession of saying that 5's gameplay is definitely better than Virtua Fighter 2's. However, gameplay is only part of the picture, and yeah, when looking at everything else, especially considering that Virtua Fighter 2 marked the pinnacle of the franchise for the most part, yeah, it also marked the point when, like, the series went from being pretty fun to play to really, really fun to play. I don't know, I couldn't help but place this over 5 Ultimate Showdown. Released in 1994 in arcades, just a year after the first game made its global debut, Virtua Fighter 2 improved on everything from the first game by a considerable magnitude. The most obvious improvements were the game's visuals, including the character models, which no longer looked like something you'd see during sleep paralysis, and also the stages looked way better too. Speaking of the stages, some of the stages are still the most iconic and just awesome stages in the entire Virtua Fighter series to this day. Several new characters were also thrown in, including Leon, who can, yeah, burn in hell. God, I hate that guy. However, in some seemingly impossible feat, somehow AM2 made the soundtrack of Virtua Fighter 2 even better than the first game, which, yeah, that's saying quite a bit. Seriously though, Virtua Fighter 2's OST is one of my favorites, period, of like any game ever. We're not even talking about just Virtua Fighter games. Going back to Virtua Fighter 2's gameplay, it was so dramatically improved over the first VF that, yeah, there was just like no comparison whatsoever to the quality of how it felt to actually play Virtua Fighter 2. There was way more effort put into the character balancing, the controls and inputs were sharpened noticeably, and new moves were added to make this a much more dynamic and competitive fighting game overall. And yeah, even with those improvements, this game still has some egregious balancing issues and annoying characters, but it still doesn't distract from how fun Virtua Fighter 2 still is to play. And before I move on here, on a personal note, if we were ranking these games based solely on nostalgia, yeah, Virtua Fighter 2 would definitely rank number 1, no question whatsoever. I have a treasure trove of memories playing this game with friends back in the 90s on the Saturn and also in the arcades, as well as the countless hours I've played VF2 since then. Luckily, there are many ways to play Virtua Fighter 2 now beyond just owning a Saturn, and also, if you're so inclined, you can also play Virtua Fighter 2.1, which is a slightly better looking, slightly better playing game compared to vanilla Virtua Fighter 2. Honestly, I don't really prefer it over vanilla 2, but yeah, either's a great game, so yeah, just play one of them. Just, yeah, avoid that Sega Genesis version. Oh god. Okay, kidding. It's not that bad. Well, sort of. But yeah, because Virtua Fighter 2 still looks and plays amazingly well, and also represents the peak of this franchise, and yeah, it being the de facto 3D fighting game of its time, it absolutely deserves to be ranked as the second best Virtua Fighter game ever made. Number 1, Virtua Fighter 4 Final Tuned. Prior to playing the arcade-exclusive Virtua Fighter 4 Final Tuned, I actually had Virtua Fighter 2 as the #1 Virtua Fighter game, with Virtua Fighter 5 Ultimate Shodown being number 2. Don't get me wrong, Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution was an incredibly good game in its own right, but it just didn't really compare to VF5's tight gameplay or how iconic VF2 was and still kind of is. Leading up to playing Final Tuned, all I kept on reading online was how it was way better than 4 Evolution and how you have to play it just to see how great it really is. And I'll admit, I was pretty skeptical, but yeah, after playing a ton of Virtua Fighter 4 Final Tuned, you can now call me a true believer. Virtua Fighter 4 Final Tuned is one of the most masterfully balanced, well-made fighting games I have ever had the pleasure of playing. Seriously, it is unfrickin' real just how good this 2004 final version of Virtua Fighter 4 is. Not only do you get all the new characters introduced in Evolution, but all the stages as well, but they've been completely overhauled, so yeah, it feels like a fresh, unique experience. Speaking of the stages in Final Tuned, these are some of the most interesting and memorable I've ever seen in any Virtua Fighter game. Yes, even more than some of the stages in Virtua Fighter 2. But more than Final Tune's presentation is that sweet gameplay, which literally had me unable to stop playing this game for hours upon hours on end. And you might be thinking right now, oh, well, I've played 4 Evolution, I can skip Final Tuned, right? Yeah, no, you cannot.
You guys all think you're so much better than me.
Oh, Meg, that is the least fancy thing I have ever heard.
Really, it's nuts how dramatically better VF4 Final Tune feels and plays over the already good Evolution. I am dead serious about that. I'm honestly shocked this game isn't discussed more, even with how limited VF4 Final Tune's release was, which, yeah, if you lived outside Japan, you kinda got screwed here. This leads me to the worst part about Virtua Fighter 4 Final Tune, which is how incredibly hard it is to play this game, even over 20 years later. Unfortunately, Sega thought us gamers in the West had had enough of Virtua Fighter 2 by 2004 and never released this game on this side of the Pacific. What this meant is that almost nobody knew Final Tune even existed outside Japan, which is something that is still unfortunately very true. To this day, there's never been a port of this game outside the arcade, which, yeah, essentially means that you're either going to have to track down a Sega Naomi 2 system and this game, or, yeah, attempt to emulate it, which, yeah, that means dealing with glitches galore, and yeah, trust me, there are some pretty crazy glitches when trying to emulate this game. It's seriously a Greek tragedy this game has never officially been given a widespread release by Sega, with how good it is and just how it represents the very best in the Virtua Fighter franchise even to this day. And ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. This concludes another countdown of the top 5 Virtua Fighter games ever made. And look, I realize that some of my placements might be a bit controversial to some, but everyone's opinion of this series is going to be different. And yeah, this is just how I would rank these games. But yeah, overall, I imagine that your top 5 would at least include most of these games, if not all of them. Still, whether you played Virtua Fighter 5 Ultimate Showdown, you would definitely place it at the #1 spot, or you feel like it's a travesty that Fighters Mega Mix was even mentioned at all, I at least hope that you enjoyed watching, you know, some random internet guy talk about his favorite Virtua Fighter games. And if you did, yeah, please consider liking and subscribing to this channel for more arcade game, fighting game, shmup, and other video game related content in the future. Like probably all of you, I absolutely love video games, and yeah, I also like talking about them, so yeah, you can count on seeing me again soon doing just that. But anyhow, I blabbered on long enough. Yeah, stay safe and sane, everyone, and I will see you again soon. Take care.